Mark Thompson swirled the whiskey in his crystal glass, watching the amber liquid catch the dim glow of the party lights. From his vantage point in the plush penthouse lounge, the world felt small and entirely within his grasp. At 30, Mark had built an empire of startups and risky investments, earning him wealth, status, and a lifestyle that matched his insatiable appetite for thrill. Surrounded by equally successful and equally bored friends, Mark felt the familiar twinge of dissatisfaction creeping in. Another extravagant night, another empty indulgence. "Admit, Mark, you've run out of challenges," Ryan declared, leaning back on the leather sofa. Ryan, always the provocateur, had a grin that matched his sharp suits and sharper tongue. Mark smirked but didn't respond immediately. He let the silence hang, enjoying the anticipation in the room. "So, give me a challenge," he finally said, his voice low and lazy, tinged with mockery. Ryan's eyes lit up. "All right, but not some cheap thrill. I'm talking about something real. How about this? You get married." The laughter that erupted around the room was instantaneous, loud, and derisive. Mark raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Marry? What's the fun in that?" he asked, his tone dripping with cynicism. Ryan shrugged. "Because you'd never do it. You're too picky, too into your perfect little world of models and jet-set flings. But what if you married someone completely outside your type? Someone unexpected? Like who?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with amusement. Ryan gestured across the room where a cluster of guests mingled near the bar. "How about hers?" Mark followed Ryan's gaze and saw her immediately. Grace Carter. She stood out among the glittering crowd, not for her opulence, but for her poise. Dressed in an elegant but understated gown, her silver hair framed a face that exuded intelligence and sophistication. At 61, she looked nothing like the women who usually caught Mark's eye. Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "She's twice my age, Ryan. Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Ryan said, leaning forward with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Marry her. A real wedding. None of your usual games. If you can pull it off and keep her convinced, you win. If you can't, and what do I win?" Mark asked, the edge of challenge now piquing his interest. "Bragging rights," Ryan said with a grin. "And 100 grand. But if you lose, that same 100 grand goes to charity." Mark considered for a moment, swirling his drink again. The bet was outrageous, absurd. But as he glanced back at Grace, standing tall and self-assured among the crowd, a slow, devilish smile crept across his face. "Deal," he said, raising his glass. The room erupted in cheers and laughter, but Mark's gaze lingered on Grace. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to become the centerpiece of his most audacious game yet. The gala was in full swing, a parade of high society figures clinking glasses under chandeliers that dripped with crystals. Mark scanned the room, his sharp gaze settling on Grace Carter. She was different, radiating an aura of quiet strength that seemed at odds with the frivolity of the event. She stood near the auction table, engaged in an animated conversation with an elderly man. Her laughter carried across the space, rich and unrestrained. Mark was used to people who laughed for effect, who performed joy as part of a social script. But Grace, she seemed genuinely amused, completely at ease in her skin. He approached slowly, careful to project an air of casual charm. Timing was everything. He waited until the man she was speaking to excused himself, then stepped into her line of sight. "Enjoying yourself?" Mark asked, his tone warm but measured. Grace turned to him, her hazel eyes assessing him in a single glance. "I am," she replied, her voice smooth and confident. "Though I admit I'm more here for the cause than the company." Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A noble reason to attend. I take it you're passionate about the Foundation's work." "Passionate enough to put in a bid for a ridiculously overpriced painting," Grace said with a smile, gesturing toward the auction catalog in her hand. "And you? Are you here for the art, or do you just enjoy being seen?" The jab was subtle but unmistakable. Mark's grin widened. "Touché. I suppose I'm here for both. Though I'm finding the conversation unexpectedly refreshing. Grace tilted her head, studying him. Flattery doesn't suit everyone, Mr. Thompson. Mark Thompson. He extended his hand, and she took it briefly, her grip firm. Grace Carter, she replied. So, Mark, tell me, how often do you make your way to these events? Or should I say, how often do you prey on unsuspecting donors? Mark laughed, genuinely amused. I assure you, I'm here with only the purest intentions. Grace said, narrowing her eyes playfully. Somehow, I doubt that. The exchange left Mark both challenged and intrigued. Most people melted under his charm or played along, eager to please him. Grace, on the other hand, pushed back, wielding her wit with precision. As the night progressed, Mark stayed by her side, effortlessly weaving their conversation through topics ranging from art to travel to philanthropy. Grace was sharp, her stories layered with humor and a depth that caught Mark off guard. So, what about you, Grace? He asked at one point, leaning against the table they now shared. You don't seem like the type to enjoy extravagant galas. I don't, typically, she admitted. But the Foundation's work is close to my heart. My late husband was deeply involved in causes like these, and I've tried to carry on his legacy. Mark nodded, sensing the subtle shift in her tone. That's admirable. Carrying on something meaningful. Grace gave him a sidelong glance, her expression softening for the briefest moment before the walls came back up. And you, Mark, what legacy are you building? The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, his mind racing for an answer that didn't feel hollow. I suppose I'm still figuring that out. Fair enough, Grace said, her smile returning but with an edge of curiosity. By the end of the night, Mark found himself more captivated than he anticipated. Grace wasn't just a name to tick off his list for the bet. She was intriguing, enigmatic, and unlike anyone he'd met before. As she excused herself to leave, Mark stepped forward. Grace, he called out, I'd love to continue our conversation sometime. She paused, turning to face him fully. Is that so? Absolutely, he said, flashing his most disarming smile. Grace regarded him for a long moment before reaching into her clutch and pulling out a card. All right, Mr. Thompson, impress me. She handed him the card and walked away, her presence lingering like the faintest trace of perfume. Mark looked down at the card, his heart beating faster than he cared to admit. The game was officially on, but for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely sure he was in control of it. The following weeks unfolded like a game of chess, every interaction with Grace Carter a carefully calculated move. For Mark, who was accustomed to effortless conquests, winning over Grace required an entirely different strategy. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or his charm, not in the way others were. Instead, she seemed more interested in substance, in sincerity, or at least what Mark could convincingly imitate. Their meetings were casual at first, though always curated by Mark to appear serendipitous. A bump into her at a high-end bookstore, a coincidental attendance at the same art exhibit, an invitation to a private charity luncheon where her name was suddenly added to the guest list. Grace noticed the pattern, of course, and she was too intelligent not to. You have a remarkable knack for being exactly where I am, she remarked one afternoon, seated across from Mark at a quaint cafe. The crisp autumn air swirled between them, carrying the faint scent of roasted coffee and fallen leaves. Mark leaned back in his chair, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. Maybe it's fate, he said, though the sparkle in his eyes betrayed the effort behind the coincidence. Grace chuckled softly, shaking her head. Or maybe you're just persistent. I prefer the term determined, Mark countered, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. After all, I can't think of a more worthwhile pursuit than spending time with you. Her gaze lingered on him, assessing. She was quiet for a moment before responding, her voice steady. You're charming, Mark. I'll give you that. But charm only goes so far. And what goes further? He asked, leaning in slightly, genuinely curious. Honesty, Grace replied without hesitation. The word hung between them, cutting through the warmth of the conversation. For a brief moment, Mark faltered. Honesty was not a cornerstone of his life, especially not now, with the bet hanging over his head. Yet he couldn't help but admire her directness. "That's fair," he said, recovering quickly. "I'll have to keep that in mind." As the days turned into weeks, their dynamic deepened. Grace's initial wariness began to soften, and Mark found himself making gestures that weren't just calculated moves. He listened intently when she spoke about her late husband, about the life she'd built, and the causes she cared for. He found himself genuinely enjoying their conversations, drawn to the quiet strength that underpinned her every word. It was during one of these evenings, over a private dinner at a rooftop restaurant, that Mark made his move. The city lights stretched out below them, glittering like a sea of stars, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the nearby garden. "I've been thinking," Mark began, his tone uncharacteristically serious. Grace looked up from her plate, her brow arching slightly. "About what?" Mark took a deep breath, his heart racing in a way he hadn't expected. "About us. About how much I've come to admire you." Her expression softened, but there was a flicker of caution in her eyes. "Mark, no, hear me out," he said, leaning forward. "You're incredible, Grace. I've never met anyone like you. And I know this might sound impulsive, but I feel like we could create something extraordinary together." Grace placed her fork down slowly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "What are you saying?" Mark reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple yet elegant diamond ring, the stone catching the soft candlelight. "I'm saying I want to marry you," he said, his voice steady but his chest tight with anticipation. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Grace's initial reaction was one of stunned silence. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest, her fingers brushing the delicate silver chain she always wore. "You can't be serious," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Mark said, his gaze unwavering. "I know it's sudden, but I've never been more certain of anything." Grace shook her head, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "Mark, this is unexpected, and frankly, a little absurd." "Why?" he challenged gently. "Because of our age difference. Because I live a different kind of life. None of that matters to me, Grace. I want something real, something meaningful. And I see that with you." Her expression was a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "You barely know me." "That's not true," Mark countered. "I've come to know you more in these past few weeks than I've known anyone in years. And I know enough to say that I want this." Grace hesitated, her mind racing. She had been swept off her feet before, decades ago, by a man whose promises had once felt as sincere as Mark's words now. And while she had no illusions about fairy tales, there was something about Mark's intensity, his earnestness, that tugged at her defenses. "I don't know, Mark," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This feels overwhelming." Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His touch was firm, but reassuring. "Grace, I know I'm asking a lot, but I promise I'll prove to you that this isn't some passing whim. Give me a chance to show you that I'm serious." She looked down at their joined hands, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubt and possibility. Part of her wanted to dismiss the idea outright, to retreat into the safety of her carefully constructed life. But another part, quieter yet persistent, whispered that perhaps this was an opportunity she shouldn't ignore. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "But if we do this, it's on my terms. No grand gestures, no elaborate nonsense. I've had enough of that in my life." Mark's face broke into a genuine smile, his relief palpable. "Anything you want," he said earnestly. "I just want to be with you." As Grace slipped the ring onto her finger, a wave of uncertainty washed over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's proposal carried more weight than he let on. Yet, as he looked at her with an expression of uncharacteristic vulnerability, she allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that this could be the start of something real. What neither of them realized was that this was only the beginning, a fragile foundation built on secrets and unspoken truths, destined to be tested in ways neither could predict. The day of the wedding arrived with a peculiar hush. Mark Thompson, accustomed to orchestrating grand displays of opulence, found himself overseeing the final touches on a ceremony that was strikingly understated. The venue, a small historic chapel nestled on the outskirts of Connecticut, stood in stark contrast to the glitz and glamour of Mark's usual settings. It was exactly what Grace Carter had requested. Simple, she'd said when they discussed the details. If we're going to do this, it should reflect who we are, or at least who I am. For once, Mark agreed without argument. He told himself it was just another part of the act, another step in winning the bet. But as he watched the sun streaming through the stained glass windows of the chapel, he felt a flicker of something unsettling. Was this sincerity? Inside, a small group of close friends and family gathered, their conversations a low murmur. Grace had invited only a handful of people, most of them longtime friends from her charity work. Mark's guest list was slightly larger, but still modest, considering the size of his usual entourage. Even Ryan, the architect of this entire scheme, had seemed surprised by the intimate scale of the event. "Not what I expected from you, mate," Ryan whispered as he adjusted his tie. The two stood near the front of the chapel, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Mark shot him a glance. "It's what she wanted," he said curtly. Ryan chuckled. "And you're the picture of devotion now, huh?" Mark ignored him, his eyes drifting toward the entrance where Grace would soon appear. When she did, the room fell silent. Grace stepped into the chapel, her every movement deliberate and graceful. She wore an elegant ivory dress, nothing ostentatious, just a soft satin gown that flowed like water as she walked. Her silver hair was pinned back with delicate pearls, and her hazel eyes shimmered with a quiet resolve. Mark's breath caught in his throat. For all his calculated moves and motivations, he hadn't prepared for the sight of her. There was a dignity about Grace, an authenticity that seemed to radiate outward and fill the small space. "Breathtaking," he muttered under his breath. The ceremony began without fanfare. The officiant, a soft-spoken minister with kind eyes, led them through the traditional vows. Grace's voice was steady as she repeated her promises, her words carrying a weight that Mark hadn't anticipated. When it was his turn, he stumbled slightly over the first phrase, a momentary lapse that earned a flicker of curiosity from Grace. He recovered quickly, his tone even as he pledged loyalty and love, though the words felt foreign in his mouth. "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the minister asked. Mark hesitated for the briefest moment, then met Grace's gaze. "I do," he said firmly, the sound of his own voice resonating oddly in his ears. The ceremony concluded with a soft applause, the room filled with a warmth that Mark hadn't expected. The reception was held in the chapel's modest garden, a cozy affair with a small string quartet playing classical tunes. Lanterns hung from the branches of oak trees, casting a golden glow as the sun began to set. Grace was quiet but gracious, moving through the gathering with her usual poise. She laughed softly at old friends' jokes, accepted compliments with humility, and exchanged polite pleasantries with Mark's guests. But beneath her calm exterior, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. This wasn't her world. She caught herself watching Mark more closely than she intended, trying to decipher the man she'd just married. His charm was undeniable, effortless, even, but there was a restlessness in him that she couldn't quite place. "Grace," a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Judith, a longtime friend who had been with her through the highs and lows of her life. "You look radiant, but you seem miles away." Grace smiled faintly. "Just taking it all in, I suppose." Judith studied her for a moment before lowering her voice. "Are you sure about this? Well, Grace glanced at Mark, who was standing near the garden's fountain, laughing with Ryan and another guest. "He's surprising," she admitted, "but he's also trying. And for now, that's enough." Judith didn't look convinced but nodded. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I always am," Grace replied, though the words fell hollow. Meanwhile, Mark was navigating the reception with practiced ease. He charmed Grace's friends, regaled his own guests with tales of his latest business ventures, and maintained the appearance of a devoted husband. But even as he played his part, he found his attention drifting back to Grace. She was different tonight, quieter, more introspective. There was a vulnerability about her that he hadn't seen before, and it tugged at something inside him that he didn't want to acknowledge. As the night wore on, the guests began to filter out, their congratulations and well wishes lingering in the air. Mark and Grace stood near the garden gate, bidding each person farewell. When the last guest had gone, they were finally alone. "Well," Grace said, her voice light but tinged with weariness. "We did it." Mark smiled, slipping his hands into his pockets. "We did." For a moment, they stood in silence, the cool evening air wrapping around them. Then Grace turned to him, her expression unreadable. "This is going to take some adjusting," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. Mark nodded. "I know, but I meant what I said about keeping things simple," she continued. "No pretense, no unnecessary theatrics. If this is going to work, it has to be real." Mark hesitated, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. "I understand," he said finally, though the truth was far more complicated. Grace studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "Good. Let's start there." As they made their way back into the chapel, Mark felt a strange unease creeping over him. For all his confidence and careful planning, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a game with stakes far higher than he'd anticipated. And for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure if he wanted to win. Mark awoke the morning after the wedding to a soft stream of sunlight spilling across the spacious bedroom. The room was unfamiliar, less ostentatious than his usual preferences, and lacking the sterile perfection of his penthouse. Grace's influence was already evident in their shared home. Warm-toned furniture, shelves lined with well-loved books, and art pieces that hinted at a life lived with meaning rather than excess. The faint aroma of coffee drifted through the air, mingling with the distant sound of classical music. He sat up, ruffling his hair, and realized the side of the bed beside him was empty. Grace had already started her day. Pulling on a robe, he descended the stairs to find her in the kitchen. She stood by the stove, stirring a pan of eggs with practiced ease, her movements graceful even in the casual simplicity of a linen shirt and loose trousers. "Good morning," Mark said, his voice still rough from sleep. Grace glanced over her shoulder, offering a small smile. "Good morning. Coffee's ready." He poured himself a cup, taking a seat at the modest breakfast table. It was a far cry from the elaborate spreads he was accustomed to. No catered delicacies or champagne mimosas, just eggs, toast, and fruit. Yet there was a comforting intimacy in the simplicity of all. "This is different," Mark remarked, gesturing to the table. Grace placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him before sitting down with her own. "Different good or different bad?" He hesitated, then smiled. "Different good." They ate in relative silence, broken only by the occasional exchange of polite words. For Mark, the quiet was unsettling. His mornings were usually filled with the buzz of emails, calls, and plans for his next venture. Here, with Grace, the pace was slower, deliberate. "So," Grace began, setting her fork down, "what does your day look like?" Mark shrugged. "Meetings, mostly. A few calls to investors. The usual chaos." "And that's how you like it?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "I thrive on it," he admitted, taking a sip of coffee. "What about you? What's on your agenda?" Grace smiled faintly. "I'm meeting with the board of the Children's Literacy Foundation. We're planning a fundraiser for the new community library." Mark leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You really dedicate a lot of your time to this kind of work?" "It's important to me," Grace replied simply. "I've always believed that wealth should be used to create something meaningful, something lasting." Her words struck a chord in him, though he couldn't quite articulate why. He nodded, offering no further comment. The first weeks of their marriage were marked by a strange rhythm, a dance of two very different lives trying to coexist. Mark ever the businessman, maintained his fast-paced schedule, his days filled with conference calls and late-night strategy sessions. Grace, by contrast, spent her time immersed in her philanthropic efforts, her days punctuated by meetings with local leaders and visits to community centers. It wasn't long before the differences in their lifestyles began to surface. One evening, Mark returned home after a particularly grueling day, his tie loosened and his mood sour. He found Grace in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a group of neighborhood children, their laughter filling the space as they worked on an art project spread across the coffee table. Mark paused in the doorway, caught off guard by the scene. The pristine, orderly living room he was used to was now a chaotic explosion of colored paper, glue sticks, and glitter. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone more incredulous than he intended. Grace looked up, unfazed by his expression. "The community center was closed today for maintenance, so I invited them here to finish their project." Mark forced a smile, stepping over a pile of art supplies. "Right, of course." The children barely acknowledged him, too engrossed in their creations. Grace, however, watched him closely as he made his way to the kitchen. Later that night, after the children had left and the house was quiet again, Grace approached him in his study. "Something on your mind?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. Mark looked up from his laptop, his expression guarded. "Just wasn't expecting a house full of kids when I got home." Grace folded her arms, her gaze steady. "Does that bother you?" "Not exactly," he said, hesitating. "It's just not what I'm used to." Grace nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I understand that this is an adjustment for both of you, Mark. But this is who I am. My work, the people I care about. It's all part of the package." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I'm not trying to change that. It's just new territory for me. And that's okay," Grace said gently. "But if we're going to make this work, we need to be honest with each other about what we want and what we can handle." Her words lingered with him long after she left the room. Despite their differences, there were moments of surprising harmony. One Sunday afternoon, Mark suggested they take a drive. He surprised Grace by pulling into a vineyard just outside the city, a place he'd stumbled upon during one of his business trips. "It's beautiful," Grace said as they strolled through the rows of grapevines, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the landscape. "I thought you'd like it," Mark said, his voice softer than usual. They shared a bottle of wine on the patio, their conversation flowing more easily than it had in weeks. Grace told him stories about her travels in her youth, and Mark, in turn, shared glimpses of his upbringing, memories he rarely spoke of. For a few hours, the gap between them seemed to narrow, but the tension was never far away. One evening, Mark arrived home with an expensive bracelet, a gift he hoped would impress Grace. "I saw this and thought of you," he said, presenting it with a flourish. Grace opened the box, her expression polite but unreadable. "It's lovely," she said, but there was no spark of excitement in her voice. "You don't like it?" Mark said, more a statement than a question. "It's not that," Grace said carefully. "It's just, I don't need things like this, Mark. I'd rather spend time with you, or see you involved in something meaningful." Her words stung more than he expected, though he masked it with a tight smile. Noted. The more time they spent together, the more Mark found himself questioning the life he'd built. Grace's grounded nature contrasted sharply with the superficiality of his world, forcing him to confront parts of himself he'd long ignored. And yet, despite the growing respect he felt for her, the secret of the bet loomed like a dark cloud over their relationship. Every time Grace looked at him with genuine affection, the weight of his deception grew heavier. He told himself he would find a way to reconcile it all, to navigate the tangled web of lies and truth. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. It was a rainy afternoon when Mark stumbled upon the photograph. The day had started uneventfully. Grace had left early for a meeting with her foundation, and Mark, attempting to bridge their vastly different lives, had promised to attend a charity gala in the evening. With hours to spare, he wandered through the house, exploring corners he had yet to notice. It was in Grace's study, a room lined with shelves of books and scattered with framed photographs, where the discovery occurred. Mark wasn't snooping, not intentionally, but his curiosity often got the better of him. He picked up a small leather-bound photo album resting on an antique desk. Flipping through its pages, he found images of Grace from years past, standing on a wind-swept beach, laughing with friends at what appeared to be a garden party, and posing beside a sleek vintage car. She looked younger, but unmistakably herself, her elegance timeless. As he turned another page, a photograph slipped out from between the pages. He bent to retrieve it, pausing when his eyes met the image. It was Grace, radiant as ever, standing arm in arm with a man Mark recognized immediately. His breath caught, his pulse quickening as he stared at the familiar face. The man was his father, Henry Thompson. In the photograph, Henry looked decades younger, his arm draped casually around Grace's shoulder. They were smiling, their postures relaxed, as though they belonged together. The intimacy of the image was unmistakable. Mark's mind raced. He hadn't seen this coming, not even remotely. He knew his father had lived a vibrant life before settling down, but Henry had rarely spoken of his past in detail. To see him here, connected to Grace, was both jarring and inexplicable. He set the photo down carefully, as if it might combust in his hands. The rain outside intensified, its rhythmic drumming against the windows mirroring the storm brewing in his chest. That evening, Grace returned home, her energy subdued after a long day. She found Mark in the living room, seated on the sofa with the photograph resting on the coffee table before him. "Grace," he said, his tone measured but tense. She paused, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Is everything all right?" He gestured to the photograph. "Care to explain this?" Grace froze when she saw the image, her calm exterior faltering for the first time since he'd known her. She stepped forward slowly, her expression a mixture of surprise and resignation. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In your study," Mark replied, his gaze steady. "It fell out of an album. I wasn't looking for it, Grace. But now that I've seen it, I need to know. Why are you in a photograph with my father?" Grace sighed, lowering herself into the armchair opposite him. She seemed to age in that moment, the weight of the past pressing heavily on her. "Henry and I," she began, pausing as she searched for the right words. "We were close. A long time ago." "How close?" Mark demanded, the edge in his voice sharper than he intended. Grace looked him in the eye, her expression a mixture of regret and defiance. "Very close. We were in love." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He leaned back, his mind reeling. "You were in love with my father." "Yes," Grace admitted. "It was decades ago, Mark. Before you were even born." Mark struggled to process the revelation. "And he never mentioned you?" "Not once." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not surprised. Henry was complicated. He made choices that ensured our lives went in very different directions." "What kind of choices?" Mark pressed. Grace hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the rain-streaked window. "He chose his family, his career, the life he was expected to live. And I was left behind." The room fell into a heavy silence, the air between them thick with unspoken truths. Mark spent the next few days in a haze, his thoughts consumed by the revelation. He began piecing together fragments of memories, moments from his childhood that now felt tinged with new significance. Had there been signs of regret in his father? Subtle indications of a life unlived? Determined to find answers, Mark reached out to Charles Whitaker, an old friend of the Thompson family who had known Henry since his youth. The meeting was arranged at Charles's sprawling estate, where the older man greeted Mark with a warm smile and a firm handshake. "Mark, my boy, it's been years," Charles said, leading him to a study filled with antique furniture and the scent of pipe tobacco. "What brings you to my doorstep?" Mark wasted no time, producing the photograph from his pocket. "I need you to tell me about this." About my father and Grace Carter. Charles's jovial demeanor dimmed as he took the photograph, his expression turning somber. "Ah," he murmured. "So you found out." "Found out what?" Mark asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Charles sighed, setting the photograph on the desk between them. "Your father and Grace had a love affair in their youth. They were inseparable for a time, but your grandfather, Henry's father, had other plans. He pushed Henry to marry someone more suitable, as he put it, someone who fit the family's expectations. And my father just went along with it." Mark asked, incredulous. "He didn't see much of a choice," Charles replied. "He adored Grace, but the weight of the Thompson legacy was a heavy burden. He chose duty over love. I suspect he regretted it for the rest of his life." Mark sat back, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. His father, the man he had idolized and resented in equal measure, had lived a life shaped by compromises he'd never spoken of. And Grace had been at the center of all. That night, Mark returned home to find Grace in the library, seated in an armchair with a book resting on her lap. She looked up as he entered, her expression cautious. "I spoke to Charles Whitaker," Mark said without preamble. Grace nodded, as though she had anticipated this. "And what did he tell you?" "Everything," Mark said, his voice steady. "About you and my father. About how he left you." Grace closed the book, setting it aside. "Then you understand why I never brought it up." "I understand," Mark said, though his tone carried an undercurrent of tension. "But I don't know how to feel about it. About us." Grace rose from her seat, crossing the room to stand before him. "Mark, my past with Henry doesn't change what we have now. Whatever this is, whatever it's becoming, it's separate from that." "Is it?" Mark asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Because right now, it feels like I've walked into the middle of a story I don't fully understand." Grace reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "Then let me help you understand," she said softly. But as her words hung in the air, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of the past were closing in, threatening to unravel everything they had built. In the days that followed, Mark found himself retreating inward, grappling with the revelations that had upended his understanding of Grace and of his father. He pored over old family photographs, searching for any indication of the man Henry had been before becoming the patriarch Mark had always known. Eventually, he sought out another voice from the past. Clara, his aunt and Henry's younger sister, was a woman known for her sharp wit and unfiltered honesty. She greeted him warmly when he arrived at her suburban home, her curiosity piqued by his unexpected visit. "To what do I owe this surprise?" Clara asked as she poured them both a glass of iced tea. Mark wasted no time. "I need to know about Dad," he said. "About Grace Carter." Clara's smile faded, her expression growing serious. She set her glass down and leaned back in her chair. "Ah," she said, nodding slowly. "So you found out." Mark's eyes widened. "You knew." "Of course I knew," Clara said. "Your father and Grace were the talk of the town in their day. Everyone thought they'd end up together. But then, well, you know how your grandfather was. Duty first, love second, or not at all. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Mark asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Because Henry didn't want you to know," Clara said. "He wanted to protect you from the messy parts of his life. He didn't want you to see him as anything less than perfect." Mark shook his head, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and sadness. "He wasn't perfect. Far from it." "No, he wasn't," Clara agreed. "But he loved you, Mark. And he loved Grace. In his own flawed way, he tried to do right by everyone, even if it meant losing the one person who made him truly happy." When Mark returned home that evening, he found Grace in the garden, tending to her roses under the fading light of the sunset. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. "I spoke to Clara," he said, his voice steady. Grace straightened, brushing soil from her hands. And she confirmed what I already knew," Mark said, his gaze fixed on her. "That my father loved you, that you loved him." Grace met his gaze, her shoulders square. "Does that change how you see me?" Mark hesitated, the words forming slowly in his mind. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I'm trying to understand." Grace nodded, her expression softening. "That's all I ask." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in shadows, they stood together in silence. For the first time since the truth had come to light, the distance between them felt surmountable. But both knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, and that the ghosts of the past were not so easily laid to rest. The tension between Mark and Grace simmered beneath the surface for days. Though they spoke politely, there was a deliberate avoidance of anything deeper. Mark couldn't shake the image of his father's letter or the photograph of Henry and Grace seemed to sense the weight of his unspoken questions. One evening, after an especially strained dinner, Mark finally broke. They were seated in the living room, the television on but muted, the glow casting soft shadows across the room. Grace was flipping through a book, her focus seemingly unwavering. Mark sat across from her, nursing a drink he hadn't touched in over an hour. "Why didn't he fight for you?" Mark asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. Grace froze for a moment, then carefully closed her book and set it aside. "Excuse me, my father," Mark clarified, his tone sharper than he intended. "If he loved you so much, why didn't he fight for you? Why did he just walk away?" Grace sighed, leaning back into the sofa. Her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed the weariness she felt. "It's not that simple, Mark. Love isn't always enough." "That's a convenient answer," Mark said, his frustration boiling over. He had money, influence, power. If he wanted to be with you, he could have made it happen. Grace's gaze hardened, her voice growing firmer. "And at what cost? To his family, to his reputation, to you. Henry was trying to protect everyone, me included, by abandoning you." Mark snapped. "By marrying someone else and pretending like you never existed." Grace stood abruptly, her calm demeanor cracking. "You think I don't know how much that hurt? You think I didn't feel the weight of his choices every single day? But what would you have had him do, Mark? Destroy everything he'd spent his life building? Ruin his family's name?" "Yes," Mark said, standing as well. "If he really loved you, yes." The words echoed in the room, harsh and unrelenting. Grace took a step back, her expression softening as sadness replaced her anger. "And what about me?" she asked quietly. "Do you think I didn't love him enough to let him go? To let him live the life he thought he needed to?" Mark faltered, the intensity of her words hitting him like a tidal wave. He sank back into his seat, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to feel about any of this," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "About you, about him, about us." Grace sat down across from him, her tone gentler now. "You're angry, and you have every right to be. But this isn't just about Henry. It's about you and me, Mark. And if we're going to make this work, we have to stop letting his memory dictate how we see each other." Mark looked at her, his emotions a tangled web of confusion, resentment, and something he couldn't yet name. "I don't know if I can do that." Grace reached for his hand, her touch warm and grounding. "Then let's figure out together," she said, "because I'm not giving up on this. Not on you." That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. Grace's words replayed in his mind, their sincerity both comforting and unsettling. Finally, he rose from bed and made his way to the study. The leather-bound photo album was still on the desk, and he opened it again, flipping to the photograph of Grace and his father. This time, he didn't feel the anger or betrayal that had consumed him before. Instead, he felt a profound sadness for his father, for Grace, and for the love they had lost. The next morning, Mark woke early and surprised Grace with breakfast, a gesture that was as much an olive branch as it was an attempt to bridge the growing divide between them. She raised an eyebrow at the sight of him in the kitchen, a tray of eggs, toast, and freshly brewed coffee in his hands. "What's all this?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. "An apology," Mark said simply, setting the tray on the table. "And a start." Grace smiled faintly, Taking a seat. A start to what? To figuring out how we move forward, Mark said, sitting across from her. Together. Grace studied him for a moment before nodding. I'd like that. In the weeks that followed, Mark threw himself into learning more about Grace's world. He joined her at charity events, participated in her community projects, and even attended meetings with the foundation board. Though the transition was far from seamless, Mark's impatience often clashing with Grace's measured approach, it marked the beginning of a shift in their relationship. For her part, Grace noticed the change in Mark. He seemed less guarded, more willing to engage with her on a deeper level. And though the specter of Henry still lingered, they began to carve out a space for themselves, separate from the past. One evening, as they walked through the garden together, Mark broke the comfortable silence between them. I read the letter again, he said, his voice steady. Grace glanced at him, her expression neutral. And I think I understand now, he continued. Why you kept it. Why you didn't tell me. Grace stopped walking, turning to face him. I wasn't trying to hide anything, Mark. I just didn't want the past to overshadow what we were building. It doesn't have to, Mark said, reaching for her hand. But we can't ignore it either. If we're going to make this work, we have to be honest with each other. About everything. Grace nodded slowly, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Then let's be honest, Mark. No more secrets. As they stood beneath the stars, their hands intertwined, it felt like a turning point, a fragile but genuine step toward healing. But deep down, Mark knew there were still shadows left to confront, secrets waiting to be unearthed. And the hardest truths were yet to come. The days passed with a cautious rhythm, as though Mark and Grace were testing the limits of their fragile truce. Their mornings together felt warmer, their conversations lighter, but beneath the surface, unresolved questions lingered. For Mark, the specter of his father's love for Grace still loomed, but it was no longer the raw wound it had been. Instead, it became a lens through which he began to see Grace more fully, not just as his wife, but as a woman who had lived a rich, complicated life long before he'd entered it. It was during one of these reflective moments that Mark made a decision. He needed to know more, not out of suspicion, but out of a desire to understand Grace's world, her past, and how it intertwined with his own. The opportunity came during an unexpected visit to the attic. Mark had been helping Grace reorganize some old storage boxes, a task she insisted she could manage alone, but which he had stubbornly joined. The attic was dimly lit, its beams lined with cobwebs and the faint scent of aged wood. Stacks of boxes labeled in Grace's neat handwriting filled the space, each containing pieces of her history. Careful with that one, Grace said, pointing to a large box in the corner. It's full of old documents, nothing exciting. Mark hefted it onto a nearby table, glancing at her with a grin. I'll be the judge of that. Grace chuckled, brushing dust from her hands. Suit yourself. Just don't get lost in nostalgia. As Grace descended the ladder to retrieve more items from the garage, Mark opened the box. Inside, he found files, letters, and photographs spanning decades. Most were related to Grace's philanthropic work, plans for literacy programs, handwritten notes from children thanking her for her efforts, and old event invitations. But nestled among the papers was a leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed, as though it had been handled countless times. Curious, Mark opened it to the first page. The handwriting was not Grace's, but his father's. The journal was a revelation. Each entry painted a vivid picture of Henry Thompson's life during his time with Grace. He wrote of their shared dreams, the simple joy of their conversations, and the heartbreak of their eventual separation. Mark's father had poured his soul onto the pages, chronicling a love that had defined him, but that he had ultimately abandoned. Grace is my heart, one entry read. But my father's expectations are chains I cannot break. How can I walk away from the life I've been groomed to inherit? How can I ask her to wait for a man who might never be free? Mark read on, captivated and deeply moved. His father's anguish was palpable, and for the first time, Mark began to see Henry not as the distant, powerful figure he'd known growing up, but as a man who had struggled with choices that left scars on everyone involved. Near the end of the journal, Henry's entries shifted. The regret became more pronounced, his reflections tinged with longing. I wonder if she ever thinks of me. Does she remember the way we danced in the rain? The way we laughed until our sides ached? If I could turn back time, I would choose her every time. But it's too late now. Too much has been lost. Mark closed the journal, his hands trembling. He had come seeking answers, and he had found them, more than he had bargained for. When Grace returned, she found Mark seated on the attic floor, the journal resting on his lap. She froze, her expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "You found it," she said softly. Mark looked up, his eyes searching hers. "Why didn't you tell me this existed?" Grace sighed, stepping closer. "Because it wasn't my story to tell. It was Henry's. And I didn't think you needed to carry the weight of it." Mark stood, holding the journal out to her. "But I do carry it, Grace. Whether I want to or not. This is my father we're talking about. And it's you." Grace hesitated before taking the journal, her fingers brushing against his. "I've kept this for years, not out of longing, but out of respect," she said. "Henry was a part of my life, yes. But this journal, it's a reminder of a chapter that ended long ago." Mark's voice softened. "Did you ever forgive him?" Grace met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I forgave him a long time ago, Mark. But forgiveness doesn't erase the pain. It just helps you live with it." The discovery of the journal marked a turning point for Mark. Where he had once viewed Grace through the lens of his father's shadow, he now began to see her as her own person, a woman of resilience, grace, and complexity. One evening, over a quiet dinner, Mark decided to voice what had been weighing on him. "Grace," he began, setting his fork down, "I want you to know that I understand now. Why you kept all of this. Why you didn't tell me everything right away." Grace looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Do you?" "I do," he said firmly. "And I'm sorry for how I reacted. I've been so caught up in my own feelings, my own insecurities, that I didn't take the time to see things from your perspective." Grace reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "Thank you for saying that," she said, her voice steady but warm. "It means more than you know." In the weeks that followed, Mark's efforts to bridge the gap between them grew more intentional. He began participating more actively in Grace's world, not just as an observer, but as a partner. He attended board meetings, volunteered at community events, and even helped organize a fundraising gala, something he had once dismissed as frivolous. Through all, Mark began to discover something unexpected. He wasn't just doing this for Grace. He was doing it for himself. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to wealth or status. One night, after a particularly successful charity event, Mark and Grace sat together on the patio, sharing a bottle of wine under the stars. "You've changed," Grace said, her tone thoughtful. Mark smiled faintly. "So have you." Grace laughed softly. "Maybe. Or maybe you're just seeing me for who I really am." Mark turned to her, his expression serious. "I'm seeing a lot of things for the first time. About you. About my father. About myself." Grace studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's all I ever wanted, Mark. For us to see each other clearly." As the night deepened and the stars shimmered above them, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The ghosts of the past hadn't vanished, but they no longer defined his present. For the first time, Mark saw a future with Grace, not as an extension of his father's legacy, but as something entirely their own. The air in the house felt different in the days following Mark's gradual understanding of Grace's past. The tension that had hung between them had eased, replaced by a tentative warmth. They were rebuilding something fragile yet real, and Mark found himself increasingly drawn to the life Grace had created, a life full of meaning, connection, and quiet strength. But the past, as it often does, wasn't finished revealing itself. One morning, as Mark was clearing out the attic, a task he had taken on as part of his newfound involvement in their home, he discovered a small, unmarked wooden box. It was tucked away in a corner, partially hidden beneath an old quilt. Curiosity piqued. Mark carried the box downstairs. Grace was in the garden, tending to her roses, and he decided not to interrupt her. Instead, he placed the box on the dining table and carefully opened it. Inside was a collection of items: an envelope tied with a faded red ribbon, a few loose photographs, and a leather-bound journal. Mark's pulse quickened when he realized the handwriting on the cover of the journal was his father's. For a moment, he hesitated. He had already uncovered so much, seen more of his father's hidden world than he ever thought possible. But this felt different. This felt like something deliberately left behind, waiting to be discovered. Mark opened the journal, his hands steady, but his heart racing. The entries were dated, spanning the years just before his father's marriage to his mother. At first, the pages were filled with musings about Henry's business ambitions and the pressures of his family's expectations. But as Mark delved deeper, Grace's name began to appear. "Grace has a way of grounding me," one entry read. "In a world full of pretense and artifice, she is the only person who makes me feel real. I don't deserve her, but I can't let her go." Mark continued reading, his throat tightening with each new revelation. His father had poured his heart into the journal, chronicling his love for Grace in vivid, agonizing detail. He wrote of their stolen moments, their dreams a life together, and the crushing weight of the expectations that ultimately drove them apart. One entry, dated just weeks before Henry's marriage to Mark's mother, stood out. "I have made my decision. It is not the one my heart wants, but it is the one my father demands. I cannot walk away from the life I've been given, no matter how much I long for something else. Grace deserves a man who can give her everything, and I am not that man. I will carry the memory of her with me always." Mark closed the journal, his emotions a storm of anger, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. When Grace came inside later that afternoon, she found Mark sitting at the table, the journal open before him. "You found it," she said, her voice soft but unreadable. Mark looked up, his expression conflicted. "Why didn't you tell me there was more?" Grace sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "Because I didn't think it would help. You've already learned so much, Mark. I didn't want to burden you further." "This isn't a burden," Mark said, his voice firm. "It's part of who he was, and part of who you are." Grace reached for the journal, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "Your father gave this to me the night before his wedding. He told me he couldn't bear to destroy it, but didn't want it to fall into the wrong hands. He trusted me to keep it safe. And you have," Mark said, his tone softening. "But I wish he'd trusted me, too. I grew up thinking he was this untouchable figure, someone who never doubted himself, never made mistakes. This changes everything." Grace looked at him, her eyes filled with both empathy and sorrow. "Henry wasn't perfect, Mark. None of us are. But he loved you. Whatever regrets he had, that love was never in question." Mark nodded, though the weight of his father's choices still sat heavily on him. Later that evening, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the journal held more answers than he had realized. He returned to it, flipping through the pages until he reached the final entry. "If Grace ever reads this, I hope she knows that she was the best part of my life. And if my son ever finds it, I hope he forgives me for the choices I made. I wanted to give him everything, but I see now that I may have taken more than I gave. Mark, if you're reading this, be better than I was. Choose love, even when it's hard. It's the only thing that truly matters." The words hit Mark like a thunderclap. For all his father's faults, this final plea felt deeply sincere. Henry had carried his love for Grace and his regret for his choices to the grave, but he had also carried hope for Mark. The next morning, Mark found Grace in the kitchen, sipping tea as she read the newspaper. He set the journal on the table between them, opening it to the final entry. "I think he wanted us to find this," Mark said, his voice quiet. Grace looked at the page, her eyes scanning the words. When she finished, she closed the journal and placed her hand over his. "Your father loved you, Mark," she said, "and he wanted more for you than he allowed himself." Mark nodded, the weight in his chest lifting slightly. "I see that now, but I also see that we can't keep living in his shadow. Whatever this is between us, Grace, it has to be ours, not his. Grace's eyes softened, a small smile playing at her lips. I couldn't agree more. That evening, Mark and Grace sat together on the patio, the journal placed between them, but left unopened. For the first time since their marriage, Mark felt a sense of clarity, not just about his father or Grace, but about himself. The past would always be a part of their story, but it didn't have to define their future. As the stars came out and the world grew quiet around them, Mark reached for Grace's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "This is where we start," he said softly. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice steady as she replied, "Then let's make it something worth remembering." In that moment, Mark felt the first stirrings of something real, something that no bet, no secrets, and no shadow from the past could take away. Mark and Grace's bond grew stronger in the weeks following their shared reckoning with Henry's journal. They began to navigate their marriage with a renewed sense of purpose, leaning into the quiet moments and shared goals that seemed to pull them closer. But beneath Mark's growing affection for Grace, guilt festered like an open wound. The bet, the secret he had carried since the beginning, was a weight he could no longer ignore. Every laugh they shared, every moment of tenderness, was tainted by the knowledge of his deception. Mark spent sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience. He knew that confessing the truth might destroy everything they had built, but withholding it felt like a betrayal that would eventually poison their fragile connection. It was during one of these restless nights that he decided Grace deserved the truth, no matter the cost. The opportunity presented itself during an unusually quiet evening. Grace was in the study, organizing her files for an upcoming charity gala, while Mark lingered in the doorway, watching her with a mixture of admiration and dread. "Grace," he said finally, his voice low. She looked up, her expression warm but curious. "Something on your mind?" Mark stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his tone uneven. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Grace set her papers aside, her focus shifting entirely to him. "All right," she said, her voice calm but cautious. "What is it?" Mark hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "When we met, when I first pursued you, it wasn't entirely genuine." Grace's brow furrowed slightly, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I didn't approach you out of chance, or even because I was drawn to you," Mark admitted, his voice cracking. "It started as a bet. A stupid, reckless bet with my friends." Grace's expression shifted, her warmth replaced by a growing coolness. "A bet," she repeated, her voice quiet but sharp. Mark nodded, his stomach twisting with shame. "They challenged me to marry someone completely outside of my usual type, someone they thought didn't fit into my world. And he trailed off, swallowing hard. "I saw you, and I thought it would be easy. I thought it wouldn't matter." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace's eyes, usually so kind and steady, burned with a quiet intensity that made Mark's chest tighten. "And now?" she asked finally, her tone measured but laced with emotion. "Does it still not matter?" "No," Mark said quickly, stepping closer. "It matters more than anything. You matter more than anything. Grace, I know I started this for the wrong reasons, but it's not like that anymore. I care about you, truly, deeply. This us, it's real to me now." Grace rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "And when, exactly, were you planning to tell me? Before or after you decided it was convenient?" "I didn't know how," Mark said, his voice breaking. "I was afraid of losing you." Grace laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "Afraid of losing me? Mark, you never had me. Not the way you think. Not with a foundation built on lies." Her words cut deep, and Mark felt the full weight of her disappointment settle over him. "Grace, I'm sorry," he said desperately. "I know I've hurt you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. Just don't give up on us." Grace looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly, but her guard still firmly in place. "I need time," she said finally, her voice steady but distant. "Time to think. Time to figure out if I can trust you again." Mark nodded, his heart sinking. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. Without another word, Grace left the study, leaving Mark alone with the crushing weight of his confession. The days that followed were some of the longest and most painful of Mark's life. Grace was polite but distant, her warmth replaced by a quiet reserve that made every interaction feel like a test. Mark threw himself into her charity work, hoping to prove his sincerity through action. But Grace remained cautious, her trust in him fractured. One evening, as Mark was reviewing plans for a fundraiser, Grace entered the room. She stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "You've been putting in a lot of effort," she said, her tone neutral. Mark set down his papers, turning to face her. "It's the least I can do," he said. "After everything I've done, I just want to show you that I'm serious." Grace nodded, stepping further into the room. "And what happens if I decide I can't move past this? If I decide that the betrayal is too much?" Mark's chest tightened, but he forced himself to meet her gaze. "Then I'll respect that," he said quietly. "But I'll keep trying to make things right no matter what." Grace studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "You've changed, Mark," she said finally. "And I don't just mean since your confession. I've seen it over these past months. You're not the man who made that bet." Mark's heart leapt, but he kept his voice steady. "I hope not, because I never want to be that man again." Grace sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I'm not saying I've forgiven you. Not yet. But I see that you're trying. And maybe that's a start." Mark nodded, his relief tempered by the knowledge that their journey was far from over. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. As Grace turned to leave, Mark felt a flicker of hope, fragile but genuine. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, he believed it was a road worth traveling. And as the door closed behind her, he vowed to himself that he would earn her trust no matter how long it took. The days stretched on like an open wound, the atmosphere in the house thick with unspoken emotions. Grace had retreated into herself, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a guarded distance. Mark, now acutely aware of the fragility of their relationship, gave her space while silently yearning for forgiveness. Despite her reservations, Grace carried on with her daily routines. She attended charity board meetings, oversaw the logistics for the upcoming literacy gala, and kept herself busy in the garden. To an outsider, she might have appeared unaffected, but Mark saw the weight she carried in the moments she thought no one was watching. For Mark, the guilt was unbearable. Every smile Grace offered, no matter how faint, felt like a fragile thread he was desperate to hold on to. Her silence, however, cut the deepest. It wasn't cold, but it was deliberate, leaving him wondering if she would ever truly trust him again. One evening, as Mark sat in his study reviewing his latest investment plans, he heard a soft knock at the door. He looked up to see Grace standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. "Do you have a moment?" she asked, her tone measured. Mark immediately set his work aside. "Of course. Come in." Grace stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She carried a folder in her hands, which she placed on the desk between them. "What's this?" Mark asked cautiously. "Plans for the gala," Grace said, taking a seat across from him. "I thought you might want to review them before the final meeting with the board tomorrow." Mark's brow furrowed. "You don't need my approval for this, Grace. You've handled these events for years." "I know," Grace said softly, "but you've been making an effort to be part of this world. I thought it was only fair to include you." Mark opened the folder, flipping through the detailed notes and schedules she had meticulously prepared. As he scanned the pages, a thought struck him. "This is incredible," he said, looking up at her. "But you're still doing most of the work yourself. I want to take on more of it. Help in a real way." Grace tilted her head, her expression skeptical. "Why?" "Because I need to prove to you that I'm not just playing a role," Mark said, his voice steady. This isn't about the bet anymore, Grace. It hasn't been for a long time. I care about this because I care about you. Grace studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. You're good with words, Mark, she said finally. But words aren't enough anymore. Mark nodded, swallowing hard. Then let me show you with my actions. Let me earn your trust back, one step at a time. The weeks leading up to the gala were a blur of activity. Mark immersed himself in the planning, taking on responsibilities that Grace had previously shouldered alone. He worked late into the nights, coordinating with donors, securing sponsorships, and personally visiting vendors to ensure everything was perfect. Though Grace remained reserved, she couldn't help but notice Mark's dedication. He was no longer the man who had entered her life on a whim, chasing a reckless bet. He had changed, softened, matured, and she found herself quietly rooting for him despite her lingering doubts. The night of the gala arrived, and the event was a resounding success. The venue, a grand ballroom adorned with elegant floral arrangements and glittering chandeliers, was filled with donors, philanthropists, and community leaders. Mark and Grace moved through the crowd together, greeting guests and thanking them for their support. As the night progressed, Mark found himself watching Grace with a newfound sense of admiration. She was in her element, graceful, poised, and deeply engaged with every person she spoke to. At one point, as she delivered a heartfelt speech about the importance of literacy and the impact of their work, Mark felt a pang of guilt once again. He had jeopardized this remarkable woman's trust, and yet she continued to carry herself with dignity and strength. When she finished her speech, the room erupted into applause. Grace smiled graciously, stepping down from the stage to join Mark at their table. "You were incredible," Mark said as she sat beside him. Grace glanced at him, her expression softening. "Thank you. And thank you for everything you've done to make this night happen." "It's the least I could do," Mark replied. After the gala, as they returned home, the tension between them felt slightly less sharp. Grace poured herself a glass of wine and settled on the couch, her exhaustion evident. Mark joined her, sitting a careful distance away. "Grace," he began hesitantly, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him, her expression wary but open. "What is it? Do you think we'll ever get past this?" Mark asked, his voice quiet. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" Grace took a long sip of her wine, her gaze distant. "Forgiveness isn't a switch you can flip, Mark. It's a process. And right now, I'm still in the middle of it." Mark nodded, his chest tightening. "I understand. I just want you to know that I'll wait as long as it takes." Grace set her glass down, leaning back against the couch. "It's not just about waiting. It's about proving that this, us, isn't something you'll walk away from when it stops being convenient." "I won't," Mark said earnestly. "I know I've given you every reason to doubt me, but I won't." Grace studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his. "Then keep doing what you're doing," she said softly. "Show me that you mean it. Show me that this is real." Mark nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. As the night wore on, they sat in companionable silence, the distance between them slowly narrowing. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. And for Mark, it was enough to keep fighting for. But even as they took these tentative steps forward, the shadow of their past lingered. Mark knew that earning Grace's trust would take more than grand gestures and good intentions. It would require patience, resilience, and a willingness to confront the scars they both carried. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear. Mark was no longer the man he had been when he first made that reckless bet. And for Grace, that might just be the beginning of something worth saving. The gala marked a turning point for Mark and Grace. Though the scars of Mark's betrayal still lingered, there was a subtle shift in their relationship, a tentative willingness to rebuild. For Mark, every moment with Grace felt like a second chance, one he was determined not to squander. He threw himself into her world with unrelenting commitment, taking on projects he never would have considered before. But these weren't performative acts. They were genuine attempts to align himself with the values Grace cherished. he discovered an unexpected sense of fulfillment in the work. Seeing the direct impact of their efforts on the lives of others gave him a satisfaction his wealth had never brought. One morning, as they sat at the breakfast table, Grace surprised him with a question. "Do you have plans this weekend?" she asked, her tone casual. Mark set down his coffee, intrigued. "Not yet." "Why?" Grace hesitated briefly before answering. "There's a community garden project I've been involved in for years. We're hosting a planting day, and I thought you might want to come." Mark's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Though he had accompanied Grace to formal events and meetings, this was the first time she had extended such a personal invitation. "I'd love to," he said sincerely. Grace nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good. It's not glamorous, though, so don't expect any red carpets." Mark chuckled. "I think I can manage without one." When Saturday arrived, Mark found himself standing in the middle of a bustling community garden, surrounded by volunteers of all ages. The air was filled with the earthy scent of soil and the hum of cheerful conversations. Grace moved through the crowd with her usual grace, greeting people by name and offering guidance with an ease that spoke to her deep connection with the community. Mark, shovel in hand, dug alongside a group of volunteers, earning a few skeptical glances at first. But as the hours passed, he proved himself not just willing, but eager to contribute. He listened intently to instructions, asked questions, and even cracked a few jokes that earned genuine laughs. By the end of the day, his hands were blistered, his clothes were smeared with dirt, and his heart felt inexplicably lighter. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" Grace asked as they packed up tools together. "Not all," Mark said, smiling. "Actually, I think I might have enjoyed it." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Careful, or you might get roped into leading the next project." Mark laughed. "I wouldn't mind." Grace's smile softened, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic moment, but something about it felt significant, a quiet step toward trust. Over time, Grace began to see Mark in a new light. He wasn't the same man who had entered her life on a whim, driven by arrogance and recklessness. He had changed, not just for her, but for himself. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching the sunset, Grace broke the comfortable silence between them. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" she asked, her voice contemplative. Mark glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You mean the bet?" Grace nodded. "Everything. The choices we made. The lies. The truth. All the time," Mark admitted. "And I hate myself for how it started. For how I hurt you." Grace turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You'd hurt me," she said. "But I've realized something over these past few months. People aren't defined by their worst mistakes. They're defined by how they choose to move forward." Mark's chest tightened at her words. "And do you think I'm moving forward?" "I do," Grace said softly. "I see it every day. In the way you've embraced this work. In the way you've opened yourself up to things you once dismissed. You're not the same man who walked into that gala all those months ago." Mark swallowed hard, emotion rising in his throat. "That means more than you know, Grace." Grace reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "It's not forgiveness," she said gently. "Not yet. But it's a step closer." The months that followed were filled with moments like these, small but significant steps toward healing. Together, they worked on new initiatives for Grace's foundation, expanding literacy programs and launching mentorship opportunities for underprivileged youth. Mark also began mentoring young entrepreneurs, using his business acumen to guide them toward success while emphasizing the importance of integrity and purpose. It was a role he hadn't anticipated but found deeply rewarding. Grace, too, found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She shared stories of her past with Mark, not just her time with Henry, but her life after him. The struggles she faced, the choices she made, and the strength she discovered in herself. These conversations brought them closer, their connection deepening with each shared truth. One day, as they were sorting through files for an upcoming project, Grace stumbled upon a folder she hadn't seen in years. Inside were letters from children who had benefited from her foundation's work. Thank you notes filled with heartfelt gratitude. Grace handed one of the letters to Mark, who read it aloud. Dear Miss Carter, thank you for helping me learn to read. Now I can help my little brother with his homework, and he says I'm the best big sister ever. You made this possible. Thank you. Mark's voice faltered as he finished reading, his eyes misting over. He set the letter down, turning to Grace. This is what you've built, he said, his voice filled with awe. This is the impact you've had. Grace smiled, her own eyes shimmering. It's what we've built, Mark. Together. Mark shook his head. I can't take credit for this. You were doing this long before I came along, but you've helped expand it, Grace said firmly. You've brought new ideas, new energy, and most importantly, you've shown me that people can change, that they can grow. Mark looked at her, his heart full. I wouldn't have grown without you, he said. Grace leaned forward, brushing a hand against his cheek. And I wouldn't have let you in without the man you've become. Though the road to forgiveness was far from over, Mark and Grace had found something stronger than the scars of the past, a genuine connection built on trust, resilience, and a shared vision for the future. And as they sat together, surrounded by the work they had poured their hearts into, it felt like the beginning of something new, something real. The weeks following Mark and Grace's deepened bond brought them an unexpected idea, a tribute to Henry Thompson. It had been Mark's suggestion initially, a way to honor his father's memory while acknowledging the profound influence he had on both of their lives. We could organize an exhibit, Mark proposed one evening as they sat in the living room. Something that tells his story, not just the man he became, but the man he wanted to be. Grace hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. Do you think it's wise to dredge all that up? The choices he made, the people he hurt. Mark leaned forward, his expression earnest. I think it's exactly why we should. His story isn't just about the mistakes. It's about the love, the regret, and the hope he left behind. And maybe, through this, we can find some closure. Grace considered his words, her heart heavy with the weight of the past. If we do this, she said finally, it has to be honest. No romanticizing, no glossing over the difficult parts. Agreed, Mark said, a flicker of determination lighting his gaze. The project began with Mark and Grace combing through their shared troves of memories, photographs, letters, and mementos that painted a vivid picture of Henry's life. Grace contributed items she had kept hidden for decades. Their love letters, candid snapshots from their time together, and the journal Henry had entrusted to her. Mark, in turn, unearthed items from his childhood that revealed his father's other side, a man who had quietly nurtured dreams for his son while wrestling with his own unfulfilled aspirations. The exhibition, titled Henry Thompson, A Life of Choices and Consequences, began to take shape. The event was held in a local gallery, its minimalist design allowing the artifacts to speak for themselves. The exhibit was divided into sections, each representing a chapter of Henry's life, his youth, his rise in the business world, his relationship with Grace, and his later years as a father and husband. A centerpiece of the exhibit was the leather-bound journal, displayed in a glass case with a few carefully chosen excerpts printed on nearby panels. If Grace ever reads this, I hope she knows that she was the best part of my life. The words drew quiet, contemplative reactions from the visitors, many of whom were seeing a more vulnerable side of Henry than they had ever known. On the evening of the exhibit's opening, the gallery was packed with attendees. Friends, colleagues, and even former rivals of Henry came to pay their respects, mingling as they explored the displays. Mark and Grace stood near the entrance, greeting guests and answering questions about the pieces on display. At one point, Mark found himself face to face with Ryan, the friend who had sparked the bet that had changed everything. Ryan surveyed the exhibit with a bemused expression before turning to Mark. Didn't think you had this in you, Ryan said, gesturing to the displays. This whole, heartfelt tribute thing. Mark met his gaze, his voice steady. People change, Ryan. And sometimes, the things we start for the wrong reasons end up leading us to the right ones. Ryan raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. Fair enough. I'll give you that. When the crowd finally began to thin, Grace took the stage for a short speech. Dressed in a simple but elegant navy gown, she looked out at the audience with a calm confidence. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. "This exhibit is not just a tribute to Henry Thompson, but a reflection on the choices we make and the legacies we leave behind. Henry was a man of great ambition, but also great love and complexity. He wasn't perfect, but he cared deeply for the people in his life." Grace's voice faltered briefly as her eyes met Mark's, but she pressed on. "What I hope you take away from tonight is that every decision, every relationship, shapes who we are and how we're remembered. Henry's story is a reminder that it's never too late to reflect, to grow, and to leave something meaningful behind." The audience erupted into applause as Grace stepped down from the stage, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Later, as the gallery emptied and the final guests said their goodbyes, Mark and Grace stood together in front of the journal's display. The quiet of the room felt almost sacred, the weight of the night settling over them. "He would have been proud of this," Grace said softly, her hand resting lightly on Mark's arm. Mark nodded, his gaze fixed on the journal. "I hope so. I like to think he'd want us to move forward, to build something good from everything he left behind." Grace turned to him, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and affection. "We already are, Mark. One step at a time." Mark took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Thank you for doing this with me, for trusting me enough to share this part of your life." Grace smiled faintly. "Thank you for proving that trust was worth giving." As they left the gallery that night, the weight of Henry's legacy felt lighter, not because it had diminished, but because they had chosen to carry it together. The exhibit had been more than a tribute. It had been a bridge, connecting past and present, love and loss, mistakes and redemption. And for the first time, Mark and Grace felt ready to step into the future, together, unburdened by the shadows that had once loomed so large. Months passed, and the exhibit honoring Henry Thompson became a cornerstone of Mark and Grace's relationship. It was no longer just about honoring a shared past, but about building something genuine in its wake. The echoes of Henry's life had settled into the background, and Mark and Grace began forging a new narrative, one centered entirely on themselves. Grace, ever observant, noticed the transformation in Mark. The reckless arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a steady resolve. He no longer sought to dominate conversations with charm or intellect, but instead listened deeply, fully present in the moment. In their quietest times, when they sat on the patio watching the stars, she found herself reflecting on the man he had become, and how he had challenged her own beliefs about forgiveness and second chances. Mark, too, felt a profound shift. For years, he had lived for the thrill of the chase, whether it was a business deal, an adventure, or a fleeting romance. But now, his world revolved around the steady, grounding presence of Grace. She had shown him the beauty in building something slowly, thoughtfully, and with intention. One evening, as the two prepared dinner together, Mark found himself unable to hold back a question that had been building in his heart. "Grace," he said, slicing vegetables at the counter while she stirred a pot on the stove, "do you ever wonder where we'd be if I hadn't made that stupid bet?" Grace paused, her wooden spoon hovering over the bubbling sauce. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, "but I try not to dwell on the what-ifs. We can't change how we started, Mark. All we can do is choose where we're going." Mark set the knife down, turning to face her fully. "And where do you think we're going?" Grace met his gaze, her expression softening. "I think we're finally starting to build something real, something worth fighting for." Mark's chest tightened with emotion. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. Grace stepped closer, placing a hand on his cheek. "You've earned me, Mark, not with words, but with the way you've changed, and the way you've helped me change." He leaned into her touch, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, Grace." It was the first time he'd said it aloud, and the words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Grace's eyes shimmered as a small, genuine smile curved her lips. I love you too, Mark. From that moment, their relationship deepened in ways neither had anticipated. Mark's declarations were no longer hesitant, and Grace allowed herself to trust him more freely. They began talking about the future, not in abstract terms, but in concrete plans. One sunny afternoon, as they worked in the garden, Mark brought up the idea of renewing their vows. I want us to have something that's just ours, he said, brushing soil from his hands. A fresh start. No bets, no secrets. Just us. Grace tilted her head, considering his words. You think we need a ceremony to do that? Maybe not need, Mark admitted, but I think it could be a way to celebrate how far we've come, to show the world and ourselves that this is real. Grace knelt beside him, her hands resting in the dirt. If we do this, it won't be about grand gestures or proving anything to anyone else. It'll just be about us. Mark smiled, reaching for her hand. That's all I want. The preparations for their vow renewal were simple, yet deeply meaningful. They chose a quiet meadow on the outskirts of town, surrounded by wildflowers and framed by a canopy of trees. Grace insisted on inviting only a small group of friends and family, while Mark took charge of ensuring every detail reflected their shared journey. On the day of the ceremony, the meadow was bathed in golden light as the late afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon. Grace wore a flowing dress of soft blue, her silver hair pinned back with delicate floral clips. Mark, in a tailored but understated suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him. The officiant, a close friend of Grace's, opened ceremony with a brief reflection on love's resilience. When it was time for their vows, Mark took a deep breath, his voice steady but brimming with emotion. Grace, he began, when I first met you, I didn't know what love was. I didn't understand what it meant to truly see someone, to value them for who they are, not what they could offer. You've taught me so much about patience, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Today, I promise to spend the rest of my life proving to you that this is real, that you're the best decision I've ever made. Grace's eyes glistened with tears as she reached for his hands. Her voice was steady, though her words trembled with feeling. Mark, she said, you've surprised me in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me that people can change, not because they have to, but because they want to. You've become someone I admire, someone I respect, and someone I trust with my heart. Today, I promise to continue building this life with you, one moment at a time. As they exchanged rings, the meadow seemed to hold its breath. Their small audience clapped softly as the officiant pronounced them husband and wife again. That evening, they shared a quiet celebration with their guests, a simple outdoor dinner under twinkling string lights. The atmosphere was relaxed and joyful, filled with laughter and heartfelt toasts. Toward the end of the night, Grace pulled Mark aside, leading him to a quiet corner of the meadow. The moonlight illuminated her face as she looked at him with a mixture of affection and resolve. This, she said, gesturing to the scene around them, is what I've always wanted. Not perfection, not fairy tales, just honesty and a partner who's willing to grow with me. Mark pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. You've got me, Grace, for as long as you'll have me. As they danced under the stars, with the faint strains of music drifting from the party, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing a thrill or trying to prove something. He was simply present, grounded by the woman in his arms and the love they had fought to rebuild. Grace rested her head against his chest, her heart steady as she whispered, "This feels like home." Mark smiled, pressing a kiss to her hair. It is, Grace. It always will be. And in that moment, they knew they had created something truly lasting, an unshakable foundation, built not on the mistakes of the past, but on the promise of a future filled with love, trust, and the simple joy of being together. Months after their vow renewal, life for Mark and Grace settled into a rhythm of mutual growth and quiet contentment. They continued to invest in the causes that brought them closer. Grace's literacy foundation flourished with Mark's business acumen behind the scenes, and Mark's mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs grew into a well-respected initiative. Together, they were building something larger than themselves, their relationship intertwined with the impact they were making on the world. But even as they moved forward, Grace began to reflect on the story that had led them to this point. Late one evening, as Mark worked in the study, she sat on the patio, a notebook open in her lap. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of dried leaves, and the quiet rustling of the trees was a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. She had been toying with the idea for weeks now, hesitant to bring up. Writing had always been a private outlet for her, a way to process the complexities of her life. But this story, their story, felt different. A few days later, as they shared breakfast, Grace finally broached the subject. "Mark," she began, her tone tentative but steady, "I've been thinking about writing a book." Mark looked up from his plate, intrigued. "A book? About what?" Grace hesitated briefly before answering. "About us. About the choices we've made, the paths that brought us together, and everything we've learned along the way." Mark set down his fork, his brow furrowing slightly. "That's a big story to tell." "It is," Grace agreed, "but it's also one worth telling. I think it could help people. Show them that love isn't always perfect or easy, but it's worth fighting for." Mark leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "I think it's a beautiful idea," he said finally. "But are you ready to share all of it? The bet, the mistakes, the pain?" Grace smiled faintly. "If we're going to tell the story, we have to tell the whole truth. Otherwise, it's just a fairy tale, and we both know that's not what this is." Mark reached across the table, taking her hand. "Then, let's do it together. Whatever you need, I'm with you." The process of writing the book became a journey of reflection for both of them. Grace took the lead, crafting each chapter with care, while Mark provided insights and memories she hadn't known he carried. The first few chapters were the hardest, revisiting the early days of their relationship, the recklessness of the bet, and the initial deception that had nearly torn them apart. But as the story unfolded, it transformed into something more profound, a testament to forgiveness, growth, and the resilience of love. One evening, as Grace read aloud a draft of a particularly emotional chapter, Mark felt a lump form in his throat. It was the chapter recounting the moment he had confessed the bet to her, the rawness of her pain, the uncertainty of whether they could recover. "Do you think this is too much?" Grace asked, looking up from the page. Mark shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "No, it's honest. And that's what makes it powerful." Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I just want people to see that even when love feels impossible, it's still worth choosing." "You've captured that perfectly," Mark said softly. As the months went on, the book began to take shape, its chapters weaving a narrative of redemption and connection. Grace titled it Unlikely Vows, a story of love and second chances. When the manuscript was complete, they shared it with a close circle of friends and colleagues for feedback. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, with many praising its vulnerability and relatability. "This isn't just your story," one friend told Grace. "It's a story for anyone who's ever doubted that love can survive mistakes." The book's publication marked a new chapter in their lives. It was released to critical acclaim, praised for its heartfelt honesty and deeply personal insights. Readers from all walks of life wrote letters to Grace and Mark, sharing how the book had inspired them to fight for their own relationships, to seek forgiveness, or to open themselves up to love again. One letter, from a woman in her 60s, stood out to Grace. "I thought my chance at love had passed. Your story showed me that it's never too late to find something real. Thank you for giving me hope." Grace read the letter aloud to Mark one evening, her voice breaking slightly as she finished. "This is why we did it," she said, her eyes shimmering with emotion. Mark wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "And it's why we'll keep doing it together." The success of the book brought new opportunities into their lives. Grace was invited to speak at conferences and events, sharing her insights on love, resilience, and the power of second chances. Mark often joined her, offering his perspective as someone who had learned to change and grow in ways he never thought possible. But despite the newfound attention, they remained grounded in the life they had built together. Their days were filled with simple joys: quiet mornings in the garden, evenings spent cooking together, and the occasional spontaneous road trip to explore a new corner of the country. On the first anniversary of their vow renewal, Mark surprised Grace with a handwritten letter. "It's not much," he said as he handed it to her, his cheeks slightly flushed. "But I wanted to put into words what this year has meant to me." Grace unfolded the letter, her heart swelling as she read. "Grace, a year ago, I stood in a meadow and promised to spend the rest of my life proving that what we've built, was real. I don't know if I've succeeded yet, but every day with you makes me want to try harder. You've taught me what it means to love without conditions, to grow without fear, and to embrace the kind of life I never thought I deserved. Thank you for seeing the best in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. You are my greatest gift, my deepest joy, and the reason I wake up every morning with hope. Yours, always." Mark. By the time Grace finished reading, tears were streaming down her cheeks. She looked up at Mark, her voice trembling. "You've succeeded, Mark, in more ways than you know." That evening, as they sat together beneath the stars, Grace rested her head on Mark's shoulder, her heart full. "This is the life I never thought I'd have," she said softly. Mark kissed the top of her head, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "And this is the love I never thought I'd deserve." As the night deepened and the world around them grew still, they held each other close, knowing that their story, imperfect, messy, and beautiful, was one they would continue writing together for the rest of their lives. And in that moment, they weren't just a couple bound by vows or a shared past. They were partners equals, and the authors of a love story that had transcended every mistake, every doubt, and every obstacle. A love story that was, at last, entirely their own.